Oh hey guys, my weirdly talkative uncle just died in a prison fight. He left me his old NES in his will. He also left some weird note on it. But my thing is, I hate outdated technology. Like, how can I play this thing if it's not an 8th the size with 30 of its most iconic games preloaded onto it? Well, it's best I get back to playing Shooty McShoot game on my personal computer, because nothing ever goes my way. Well, looks like my other weirdly talkative uncle also died today, and he left me his NES Classic Edition in his will. Finally. I just woke up from a coma. You guys know me, I love retro video games, and by me saying that you may also get the idea that I don't shower. But I'll have you know, I love showers. I took one like 3 weeks ago. I think that preserving older games is one of the most important things we can do for gaming as a media. Do you know how many movies before the 1950s are lost? Almost all of them, which is why I think it's very important that we preserve as many games as we can. And we can do that through a revolting invention called emulation. And through the invention of emulating games, we've gotten marvels like the at-Games Sega Genesis Mini. Fuck, never mind, we can lose the games. As more and more consoles went out of print and games became harder to find, we saw the invention of re-releases. But I hate re-releases, and like I said earlier, I refuse to play these games on a console that isn't an 8th the size. Oh, thank God. Retro mini-consoles have plagued our world for years. What started off as a little plug-and-play system that had about a dozen games preloaded onto it from old generations, went to whatever the hell this is. You got the Atari 10-in-1 TV games, real name by the way, which has, as the name says, 10 preloaded Atari games built right onto the thing. Why buy an Xbox when I can pay like 20 bucks and have Pong and Yar's Revenge? Alright, I am getting more out of this than I am out of Rainbow Six Siege. But plug-and-plays are boring and talking about them makes my hands feel sticky, so let's move to 2016. Back during the Wii U era, when Nintendo's profits were, well, in the negatives, Nintendo decided to go back to making sex dolls, the NES. They went back to making the NES. Lame. When this thing was first coming out, it was reported like Nintendo was remanufacturing the NES, like a full reprint of the console. No. Nintendo made the NES Classic Edition, which is a miniature recreation of the NES with 30 of the most iconic NES games preloaded onto it. Well, I think there are some weird picks on this thing, like for example having Super Contra but not the first Contra game, or the same thing with Mega Man. But if there are a list of 30 NES games I think are most important to put in a collection together, pretty much all of these would be here. Also Pac-Man. Yes, Pac-Man comes to my mind whenever I think of the NES, 100%. And this thing has really great build quality. Like, it might not seem super important to note, but later when we get to a certain company by the first name At and last name Games, you'll understand why. Like, this thing is built so well I can crack it over my head and... Even the controller is pretty much one-to-one of the original NES controller. Like, let's play spot the difference. Let's not actually, but they do look the same. The only real issue with this thing is that the cord for the controller is shorter than the length of insert funny joke here. Look at this thing. I have no idea why they decided to make this thing so damn short. Like, this was released in 2016, not 1985. We don't have tiny TVs that look like bombs that weigh more than a 4-story building anymore. We don't need to sit in front of them anymore. Why did they do this? And besides that, the cords for the NES Classic controllers are shorter than the original NES controllers. So it just gets me asking, how much money did they save by making these cords so short? It couldn't have been that much. This just runs the risk of kids accidentally pulling too hard on this thing and it crashes to the ground getting shattered into a million pieces, and by kids I mean me. But when times seem bleak, here comes the third parties. Never mind, but third parties made longer wires for this thing so finally I can play across the room? Hell yeah. But ignoring the controller's issues, this really is a great little collectible console, and even though I don't really use this thing because I have pretty much all of these games on my Switch, it's still a cute little thing to have on my shelf. And many other anti-sex fellas like me must have thought the same thing because almost the second this thing went for sale, it went out of stock, which made this thing a pain in the ass for collectors and guys in their mid-40s to get their hands on this thing. I had to get mine from a snake oil scalper, like 3 years after it was released. Yeah, when this thing came out I was too busy playing Kill Me Already. And Nintendo definitely saw this thing's success, and with dollar signs burned into their eyes, decided to make an SNES one. And in 2018, lo and behold, the SNES Classic Edition. This thing is basically just the NES Classic Edition, but the SNES instead. It's a miniature version of the console from the 90s with a size replica of the controller, etc, etc. What's weird about this one is that it features 10 less games than the original NES Classic Edition, only having around 20 in this one, and even though that sounds like a big problem, with some critical thinking, it's really not that big of a deal. With most NES games, they're good of course, but with most of these things, you just turn them on for like 5 minutes and have a good, what the hell am I doing? And that's pretty much it. But once the SNES era came around, these are actual games you can sink hours into. What the hell am I doing? Not that I'm saying there aren't NES games you can sink hours into. Star Tropics is one of my favorite RPGs of all time, but how much time are you really gonna get out of goddamn Ice Climber? In reality, it should be negative time. But for the SNES generation, and especially the SNES Classic Edition, there are some really big games you can sink your teeth into, like Super Mario RPG, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and many more. So yeah, 10 less games is really not that big of a problem. But the main seller for this console was the addition of a technically brand new game, being Star Fox 2. Star Fox is one of the most iconic games for the SNES, also one of the most seizure-inducing, Jesus Christ. And since this game evidently did well, Nintendo made the decision to make a sequel. No duh, but by the time the game was wrapping up, the Nintendo 64 was already out and had games that looked a lot damn better than this. So Nintendo scrapped the pretty much finished games since they knew it wouldn't sell well in comparison to the new shiny Nintendo 64 games. But they finally officially released this game after like 25 years on the SNES Classic Edition, where you can unlock the game by completing the first mission in the original Star Fox. That's actually so cool. Like, what a cool way to preserve a game that never got to be sold on shelves. Release it on a nostalgia bait version of your console that it was never meant to be played on. I know I kind of downplayed it by saying that, but it is really cool actually. And for a while, you could only play this game on the SNES Classic Edition, which is great since Nintendo still couldn't stock this thing correctly for the life of them. You guys sure are great. But then they re-released the game via Nintendo Switch Online, so woohoo, the masses can play it now. Let's see those happy Star Fox 2 players. This console is $20 more ESRP than the original NES Classic Edition, which is a little stupid I think, but what am I gonna do, not buy it? I bought it. The controller wires on this thing are slightly longer than on the NES Classic, but not enough to make any noticeable difference, but it's a thought that counts. Go fuck yourself. If it makes you feel any better, this console does take the same port as the NES Classic, so you can reuse your controller extension accessory, so hey, that's great. Now I cannot play this thing, but have controller extenders to look at. By taking a keen look at these cords, you may notice that they take the same port as the one on the bottom of the Wii Remote, which gives me an idea. F***ing, Wii Nunchuck. Yeah. These controllers can be used as classic controllers when connected to the Wii Remote, which is a very cool feature. I can use it like a mace. And if you have a vendetta against the NES or SNES controller, you can plug in a Wii Classic controller to this console, or my personal pick, the Wii Nunchuck. All this sounds very creative and great, and yes it is. It makes you think that Nintendo would want to make more classic versions of their old consoles, because this is essentially a money printer. They don't even have to develop new games, they can just repackage the old ones in a silly little box. So you may wonder what other consoles they made classic editions of. Nintendo never truly cashed in on these classic consoles, they sold their stock and never looked back, which I don't really understand. Like, you guys know people will buy these, why won't you sell them? You don't need to do anything. I mean, maybe if you want to count the Game & Watches made to celebrate Mario and Zelda's 35th anniversaries, then I guess you can. But we haven't had an official Classic Edition console since the NES Classic, which is kinda weird. Like, imagine if they made a Game Boy Classic Edition or an N64 Classic Edition. If Nintendo sold those, they would literally become the first ever company to have a stock price of $1 virgin zillion. Trust me, I did the math. After the release of the NES Classic and its almost immediate success, many other companies took a little more than notes from Nintendo and they pretty much copied their entire thing. Take, for example, Sega with a Sega Genesis Mini. This is a mini version of the first model of the Sega Genesis, and this is just about as quality as Nintendo's offerings. Really, this thing is great. My only real issue with the Genesis Mini is that I kind of feel like the lineup of games here is nowhere near as good as what Nintendo had. Like, I get it, the Genesis's first-party lineup doesn't have as many iconic games as the SNES, but it does have a few gems, and I don't feel like all of them are listed here. It has its Sonics, missing Sonic 3 and Knuckles, however, but I get it, there was some legal issues at the time. And you have your Rise Star, Streets of Rage, but I think the biggest reason to buy this console was the inclusion of Mega Man The Wily Wars, which is a beautiful remake of the first 3 Mega Man games made for the Sega Genesis. Only problem though, it is extremely hard to get your hands on. But it comes inside of the Sega Genesis Mini. Awesome. I still don't want to keep this thing plugged in, but I appreciate it. Luckily, they did eventually re-release this game through Nintendo Switch Online, so that's good, but for a while this was the easiest way to play this game, which definitely helped its sales. This mini console also has Tetris, and you might think, wait, the Genesis doesn't have Tetris, and you would be correct. While they did have a version of Tetris fully developed for the Genesis, for legal issues or whatever, it was never officially released until the release of the Genesis Mini. Too bad I can play Tetris on anything with a screen, so this thing never got too much use, but a cool novelty. They also made a mini version of the Sega Genesis Model 2 to release some more hidden gem games, which I remember posting on my Instagram story saying how cool this was, and then I promptly completely forgot about this thing. I wonder why. With Nintendo and Sega living it up, attracting 40-year-old men who can't get it up anymore, Sony watched them from a distance and decided to make their own mini console, being the PlayStation Mini. This thing wasn't great. This thing had some really spotty emulation, which is really lame. It was also like $500 million, so I don't think anyone bought it. It ended up selling so little units that Sony kept lowering the price of this thing constantly. It jumped down from 80 to 40, hell I think it even jumped down to 20 at some point, and they were just gonna pay you to take this damn thing after a while. I think some of these issues were exaggerated a little bit. Like, I think the emulation was poor but not unplayable like some people made it out to be, but still, how is it acceptable to release a PlayStation Mini with such poor emulation? I can play these games on my browser. And it also didn't have Crash Bandicoot. You know Crash Bandicoot, the PlayStation game, made to compete with Mario and Sonic, not released on the PlayStation Classic. Neither was Spyro the Dragon, no Tomb Raider. I haven't even heard of many of the games included on this console. That should tell you something. Yeah, this thing was not great, not one bit, but compared to my worst nightmare, this thing is a gift from God. At games. I would scream, but I don't want to give that much energy towards this company. Before the influx of classic mini consoles made when Nintendo released the NES Classic Edition, we had the third parties making these things for game companies, and they all suck. Most notably the company At Games. Somehow they squeezed their way into getting the rights to Sega, Atari, Konami. It's like they owed these companies a favor or something. And these consoles were infamous for their cheap build quality, poor emulation, and what the hell game inclusions. The console I remember the most was their mini Sega Genesis, where it's filled to the brim with all things but Sega Genesis games. Yes, obviously this thing does have Genesis games, but it's filled to the brim with random cheap games that they probably got the rights to re-release for free. I would say that the best thing about this console is that it's able to natively play Sega Genesis cartridges, which is actually a really cool feature, but it doesn't really run them well, and there's a million other aftermarket consoles who can play these 100 million times better, but it's the thought that counts. Kill me. You also have the Atari Flashback console, which is a surprisingly well-made console. My only issue with it though is that the clicky buttons on this thing make it feel so damn cheap, but it does have a pretty good game selection and very good emulation. Although I think that's giving it too much credit. I'm pretty sure if you have poorly running Atari games, you need to give your hardware a reality check, but still, congratulations. And there's a million other of these things, like say the ColecoVision Mini. Not playing this. My main issue with all of these consoles is that I see no real reason to keep them plugged in. I can play almost all of these games at a moment's notice on my actual consoles. Do I want to play Mario? I can play it on my Switch. Do I want to play Sonic? I can play it on my PlayStation. I'm getting nothing from keeping these consoles plugged in. Besides Sega Genesis Tetris, maybe I should keep this thing plugged in. Move over, Xbox. Going off of this classic console trend, many other companies made their own mini consoles filled to the brim with games that they somehow got their rights to. These are pretty bad, they just feel so cheap and have like no recognizable games, but if you have like $20 and you really need some entertainment, you can rob a store. I would say the prison sentence you serve is probably more worth your time than this thing. Other than these, the closest things to these mini consoles that I can think of are these mini arcade machines, which were everywhere for a while, and these are odd. I have this Galaga one, and it's pretty cool I guess, but for being a big nostalgia piece for kids who grew up playing Galaga in the arcade, why didn't they just use the original Galaga art instead of this middle school Photoshop project? How is this more appealing? You can get these in a bunch of different sizes, even nearly the same size as an actual arcade machine with these arcade 1-up things, because who needs condoms when you got... yeah. But yeah, I just spent the last few minutes talking about these classic versions of consoles from the past. I just wish that my uncles would stop dying, because in the span of me talking about these mini consoles, like 10 of my uncles died and they left me their old consoles, and what the hell am I supposed to do with these?